all of the Stellenbosch stats indicate a very, very clear linkage between level of education and employment. So the fact that you mentioned a 24% throughput, basically those 76% that aren't in that throughput are unemployed. And as you go higher, the level of employment increases. So I don't accept that argument of yours because it contradicts the statistics.
Okay.
I think this is more of a comment than a question. There's just something that I've been listening to constantly, and I want to pick up on your last point about the unemployment. And I think that within schools, children are not taught to think entrepreneurial, like to be able to employ themselves when they do get out of the system. Like you go through the system, and then at the end you expect a job, but you don't see that you can actually be creating a job or jobs for other people. And I think that's maybe something that the education department and Andrew Mochegas should be focusing more in, as to get active citizens from a very young age for the economy, because we are, the economy is what makes us. It is through money that we're sitting in this institution. And the skill would then be, how do you create wealth, or how do you create money?
Okay, Richard.
Basically says, you know, the government's putting enough money into education. That's not the problem. The problem is SATU. I mean, what would your response to that narrative be?
I don't know whether, I think we need to ask the question whether entrepreneurial skills can be taught. What is it that you would teach? It's a term, and I very seldom have heard anyone say what it means. I don't know whether it can be taught. And in terms of saying the blame can't be placed on the education system, which is not, I think, what you were saying. It's the gap between what Ashley was asking earlier. That there's a problem with the way in which our economy is structured. And in terms of creating work, I want to ask people here whether you don't think that part of the problem we have in South Africa is that we don't channel money and create work to maintain the systems that are essential for an economy to work, like Eskom, like proper plumbing and piping for water, like fixing roads in good time, that you don't have half the road washing away, and then you do patch jobs and patch jobs and more patch jobs. And I think of just those three as essential maintenance of infrastructural aspects of an economy. And it seems to me that across a range of infrastructural aspects of our economy, we do not, as a society, in terms of how the GDP goes, is cut, we do not spend enough money on maintenance. And 20 years down the line, or I don't know if 20 years is the right, in 94 is the right place to look from, whatever the date is to say, so many years down the line, we have key aspects of our infrastructure that are breaking down. And potentially to maintain those things would require fleets of people to work to maintain them. And I think we look to entrepreneurial skills, teach this in school, and I think what is it that people are supposed to teach? And on the other hand, we're not looking seriously at why the infrastructure around us is crumbling.
I just want to clarify whether I got it right. If I say that we know that if you look at the evidence, you will see that the higher your level of education, which means if you have a university degree, you have a much greater chance of entering the employment market, right? So it is true, and the unemployment rate, the last statistic that I look at was just saying that about 8% of people with degrees, with higher education qualifications, seem to be unemployed, 8%, right? Now, I've also looked a little bit more carefully at how they arrive at some of these stats. And what I'm not seeing is when universities are doing these studies, when they look at these traces studies, the way they record this, it doesn't tell us what is the nature of the employment of their graduates who find employment. And most of their data seem to end after 1 year. There's no longitudinal study that tells us whether this is it a short-term contract, is it a long-term contract, what is the nature of that work. So it is true that the higher, you have a better chance of finding work if you have a degree. We have a statistic of about 350,000 what they call diplomates. These are students from TVET colleges who do not have work, and it proves the point. It's the unemployment rate amongst diplomates is roughly 35%. But I think the point that I want to make is that this idea that there's a linear relationship between education and employment is false. It is absolutely not true, but it is true that the higher, if you have a degree, you have a better chance of finding employment. Right? So that is the point that I want to make. The issue around entrepreneurship, this is an interesting question, an important one. And I'm giving you an example now, and I'm going to the mine workers, and I'm looking at large numbers of mine workers being retrenched, who've been encouraged to become entrepreneurs. Young people who cannot find employment, who are encouraged to start their own businesses. They must, they must fire up their entrepreneurial spirit and so on. What we have seen, and this is research work done by the Mining Development Agency, where mine workers who were retrenched were encouraged, they were put through a series of training programs to develop business plans and so on, who then went back, many of them from the Eastern Cape, by the way, came back to start chicken farms and agricultural activities and so on. And 6 months down the line, 80% of them were down the drain. In the same way that 90% of all these co-ops are not functioning. And so I'm not an economist, but what it says to me is that, and if you take the chicken farming examples, where Rainbow Chickens, for example, comes into a community where there's an entrepreneur who wants to sell his chickens, drops the price of the chicken by 10% for 3 months, and simply wipes out that business. So the idea of entrepreneurships need to be connected to how markets work. Markets are hostile. Capitalists are not the friendliest people, right? For them, the bottom line is what counts, and they will do whatever they can to make their profits, and they will wipe out businesses. So I think, of course, there's a need to encourage these things, but one has to be mindful of how markets work and the impact and how markets are influencing or guarantees the successes of these kinds of business ventures. The issue around, Richard, the issue about SATU, that's a tough question. I've heard that before, and there is obviously some truth. I mean, you can even take it further. You could say that it's COSATU. You could say that the problem with the education crisis, you can put it lay down at the feet of COSATU as well. So I think there is an element of truth that SATU may well be, one could say that they are implicated in this problem because of their relationship with the state. And it takes us to this argument as to whether it is useful for a labor movement to have such close association with government. But I think there's another element where I think there is truth in SATU's being implicated. You know that SATU has not had a single education conference in the last, I think, the last 5-6 years. So there has not been much discussion amongst teachers, for that matter, around the crisis of education at all. So that's what I have to say about SATU. I can't say more, but I do think that there is a definite element of truth, and it is connected to this relationship between the state and COSATU. I think it's an unhealthy alliance, and I would support a movement where there is a separation between trade unions and the state.
That is Monica. Monica's question.
I thought Monica didn't ask a question, she was making a comment.
Oh, okay.
But I think that the point is an important one, because I think this
infrastructure
is where this is an important point, Monica, because we've been talking about the relationship between employment and work. And, you know, as I said, under capitalism, the way that we think about work is employment. But work is much broader than that. And I think there is an opportunity, and I think there's a need to start looking at what we call socially forms of useful work, socially useful work, where people are begin to get involved in forms of work that are autonomous, that is less alienating, and that are directly connected to the needs of people in communities. So I think one of the things that is possible, and I think the reason why I think it's not being done is because of the way that the state's funding mechanisms work, is you can imagine that if you live in a community where the hospitals are falling apart, you have school buildings that haven't been maintained, there's a need for water, plumbing, electricity to be installed in communities. And we have these wonderful technical vocational colleges where these skills are meant to be produced, that these skills are being used in a way to fix up our infrastructure and so on. But you know how the state's funding formula works. It works through tender processes. So instead of rerouting funding in another way, so that funding can flow into solidaristic forms of cooperation or solidaristic co-ops, not the government ones, because they are not actually co-ops, they are businesses that fail one after the other, but more community-driven co-ops through which funding can be channeled to fix up the infrastructure. I think that is one way of how we can get people to work. So it is based on a critique of the Extended Public Works Program. I think that Extended Public Works Program has that possibility. There's a possibility that it could do that kind of work, but it needs to be radically reconceptualized.
Okay, let's take another round. Yes?
Thanks, Prof. I want to start with the conceptual framing of the crisis. Because, for instance, if someone comes outside South Africa and we are talking about this crisis, we will understand who's mostly affected by the crisis. So I think we need to be clear in the conceptual framing of the crisis, that the crisis is anti-black and the crisis is anti-poor and anti-working class. those who come from upper and middle class in public education are not mostly affected by the crisis. So I think we need to clarify the conceptual framing of the crisis, that it continues to be anti-poor, it continues to be anti-black. Majority who are affected by the crisis is the township education, is the rural education. And I want to agree with you that if we have to reflect on the crisis of education, one needs to employ the historical analysis that it is the legacy of apartheid, but at the same time sustained by the political elites post-1994. And the crisis is structural. There's no quick fix, one-dimensional solution. So all stakeholders must be involved in the solution, community engaged, university students, civil society, and government. But I want to speak to your third point of not being convinced that the current policy or state intervention will lead to transformation. Because the dominant discourse is that the government is failing to provide quality education, particularly for the poor and the black. Now, I don't agree with that dominant discourse. The government is not failing here. In fact, they are succeeding. I'm saying this because they are succeeding in categorizing black and working class kids into creating black children. To use the words of Dr. Ash, that they are succeeding to actually govern by poverty. In providing poor education for black communities and the working class, government is succeeding. The buildings that they actually render in school renovation and all of that, those are cosmetic exercises. They don't actually disrupt and radically change the structural trappings of our public education, which is the township and rural education, which is used as an instrument to reproduce the class inequalities. Even though the selected few in rural and township escape that situation, which Pierre Bourdieu, the French sociologist, say it's a miraculously safe. Though there are people, the working class in the rural and the township, who escape that structural trappings of our education. But I'm not actually convinced that the state and the policies and all of these government interventions want to succeed in providing quality education for the black and the working class. So they can intervene in PE, but the actual reasoning is not actually to radically change the education system, is to actually categorize and turn black working class into hopers for cheap black labor. Yeah.
I don't think I'm saying anything different to what you just said.
Any other questions or comments?
Despite the problems and the dysfunctionality of education in the northern areas of Port Elizabeth, there are also schools where, and NNMU, your university, is involved in a project to make education work better, make schools work better. Let me rephrase, make schools work better, even in a context of poverty. And we had a person come, a principal of one of those schools, come here to Rhodes to speak. I forget his name, but the school was Sapphire Primary. I remember the name of his school, Sapphire Primary. And I'm sure you know about Sapphire Primary. And maybe to look at something at what I call the outlier schools, where for the 20 schools in a rural area, in a township, with poor textbooks and numbers of textbooks per learner and all the rest, the outlier schools, despite the same contextual factors, have a success rate that the neighbouring 19 schools do not. And across South Africa and rural South Africa, there are such schools. And Sapphire Road is maybe one of these outlier schools. And perhaps we need to understand them better, because they exist across the spectrum, rural, urban, and in the whole of South Africa. So maybe tell us about Sapphire Road and this project, because otherwise, as I say, I've been in many such discussions, and it just is paralyzing in the immensity of the problem.
I think the Sapphire example is a very good example of having kind of a visionary leadership at the particular school, someone who is really seeing the school as part of community, that you cannot divorce a school from where it is located, and that the school is a reflection of its surroundings. So here you have an example of a principal who is really conceptualizing the idea of a community school, that the school is rooted in community, and what he's doing is he, because of his leadership, his curiosity, his energy, has been able to mobilize a variety of different people to come and support him to make the school what it is. So the school is a really good example of how he is recognizing that the students, for example, come from working class or precarious workers, the non-working class, people who do not have jobs, and they've created a place to feed, and he involved 80 parents in his school, cooking, providing the children with food. He has people from the community fixing up the school building. He's introduced a community health program in the school. He is creating a physical activity for the kids at the school, and just a growing number of activities. And for him, the idea of a school is about developing a level of participatory citizenship, working closely with family, with parents, working with the university. So this is about someone who I think is visionary. He has leadership, which I think is not common. And I think his work is somewhat unique, and it provides us with a model that needs, I think, that may have to be amplified. We need to expand it and to encourage leadership and engagement amongst our principals. And I do think leadership in this case is an extraordinarily important characteristic of a school principal. So that is a nice model. There's another one which I'm part of, where we are looking at community education, and we're working in the Zwede area, right? So this is on the other side of the dividing line, because remember, Port Elizabeth is still very much divided along old apartheid racial groups. So I'm working on the other side. So I'm working in the eastern part of Port Elizabeth, and here we're busy working with about 60 community investigators, doing community-based research in order to understand how people experience health, waste, their environment, energy, and the idea is to work with community groups to create non-formal education programs that speak directly to the needs of the community. So the curriculum is emerging out of the data that these community investigators gather. And what they then do is a lot of it is using a Freirean community participatory action model of research, and they're codifying these images, so they take photographs and so on, and then they present this in community halls. And the success of this is shown in the engagement. So we hire a hall, community hall, and we have within 3 days, we have 800 people coming through that program. And it is not so much the numbers that's important for us, but what people say and what they raise, which draws them into discussions around issues facing the community. And as a result of that, we now have 14 reading clubs, not organized by us, by individuals in the community investigators, organized 14 reading clubs. So they are gathering reading materials and they're organizing themselves. They have no training around how to run a reading club. They only have a booklet like that. that we have produced. So they run reading clubs. They have created a model of a community education center based on their research, and the model is something like this. They are looking at a school building that's currently empty. They are arguing that they want to use the land, the vacant land, which is fairly fertile. They want to use the land as a laboratory for food production that can then be fed into a school nutrition program, which is somehow connected to a clinic that they want in this very same complex. They have all these other brilliant ideas about running weekly documentaries in the school building. So there's a model of where a building is used as a site for community education, but it's not the only place. So they have their reading clubs. There are butchers running, in the community. So people are slaughtering animals right there on the street, right? So there's the local butcher is right there. So they want to connect their education programs to the waste management, food production, agricultural activity, reading clubs within that community. So that work is now about a year old, and we have an audience of approximately 1,000 people just within one community. So it shows you what education can do, and that we should not really be too fixated on the formal curriculum, the school curriculum, but that there are other forms of knowledge, that communities are producing all kinds of interesting forms of knowledge, and when you organize the knowledge in a way, it becomes incredibly meaningful to them. So that is another piece of work that is unfolding in that area, and it's tied to government's plans around this idea of a community college. And we think this could be the contribution of non-formal education, forms of community-based research that could be part of a program of a future community college.
Yes, actually.
Can I just give an anecdote to talk to a black public school in the old Cape Province is Nathaniel Nyaluza in Fingo Village, which services Fingo and Vukani. The June exam, it's a large class this year, so there are 3 classes, 12A, B and C. There are 90 kids doing geography, for example. 88 of those 90 kids got less than 30% in their June exams. The average mark is 11% for geography. So 40 kids were single-digit results. The average mark in life sciences in Nathaniel Nyaluza in June is 17%. So this is right here. I mean, and I think that the issue of university responsibility and what we, all of us in this room and in this university, are doing about a situation like that is a very, very serious issue, and I'm very glad that you raised that. Now, it's quite interesting because you can contrast that to Nsika, which is equally resourced to Nyaluza, where there are already 5 kids from this year's grade 12 class with applications that are going to be accepted at Rhodes. A pass rate in June of over 75% with a reasonable number of bachelors and diplomas. I mean, it's just the overall pass rate at Nyaluza, by the way, of 110 kids, 8 kids passed their exams. So an 7 to 8% pass rate. Nyaluza, 76% pass rate. At Nsika, same resourcing, different leadership. And I think, I just wanted to highlight those 2 points. I mean, I think structurally what Mr. Paul is saying is absolutely correct. What is our role as this community in relation? Is that acceptable to us in this room? And if it's not acceptable, what do we do about it? And then how do we make sure that good leadership, such as the leadership at Nsika, is protected in this city, so that those kids that are being serviced with schools where there's proper leadership in place are protected and strengthened? Because Previously, Niluza was under a very good principal with the surname Mushwana, who was chased out of that school by the union forces that Richard is referring to, because he made teachers actually teach. So how do we, I think all of these issues are really, really important, and as a community, an academic community, we need to think very, very carefully about what we actually, first of all, understanding what's going on, and then secondly, what do we do? Because otherwise, I mean, Fingo, we can walk to Fingo, it's that close. It's right here. It's just amazing. It's acceptable to us.
Just a second, there's something.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I also buy into that we need to think more carefully about this kind of issues. However, I would differ. I would differ and say that I sort of find it surprising that, I mean, you would actually believe that the government would be intentionally, would intentionally want not to educate black people in order to maintain the class systems that we have. And I suppose there, I mean, one would probably need more rigor to say at what point level of government is one talking about and who is one talking about, because I mean, it would certainly, to me, it would seem absurd to believe that, well, right, one of the longest presidents that we've had, Thabo Mbeki, was intentionally trying to ensure that black people do not get educated. I've simply never seen anyone or any president that is interested in the question of education, higher education in South Africa, and how it can be used to change people's lives. And so for someone to believe that he could have run a government that could have intentionally tried to, I don't know, to maintain a certain class system that would deprive black children of attaining education would, to me, sound like a reckless thing, which is why I would say that one would probably have to say, at what point of government is one talking about and what is happening within those specific institutions. Because, for instance, you find that, a huge problem that we have within the Eastern Cape education system is one where there's political infighting, and therefore questions that determine who becomes the MEC or who runs the state education department as a result of those factions that occur there. And then you go to Limpopo, you find that there's a lot of corruption that occurs there that has an impact on this education, while you actually have a government that may as well be interested in ensuring that that the country has a good education system. However, because of the nature of how we organize our society, different provinces, different regions respond differently. And I think one would need to become aware of that and not simply say that the Thabo Mbeki does not want these black children to be educated because he wants to make them go work at the factories and so forth. So I certainly want more sort of exactly, and the reason why then I'll come back to that to say, how does one respond to it? It seems to me that one of the things that we have to confront about post-apartheid South Africa, and I think one could make different arguments around the fact that we say we want to become a democracy and we have this constitution, but we also have this economic system that contradicts what happens here. And so now we're coming to see that actually you have, let's say, an economic system, a neoliberal system, which actually goes against certain things that our constitution and our democracy wants to achieve. And it is possible to want to attain certain constitutional rights, to want to be a democratic country, but to not have or to have, let's say, we all know when we look back at question of gear of neoliberalism, the common sensical thing that we all say now, that the government says now is, it was after 1998, people did not know what to do and all of that stuff. And I think a lot of us, in as much as we're living with the consequences of those policies, do sort of have, a certain understanding of, what the time was and the fact that it may have been a mistake, but, actions had to be made and so forth, even though you may as well have had a government that was interested in attaining or in staying true to the principles of the Constitution. So one would make, from my perspective, one would make, different arguments about these contradictions that have occurred in government that is trying to deal with, also including, of course, the question of language and, how do you actually teach, which language do you actually, use to do that sort of a thing, and now we're reflecting and looking back and we're seeing these fractures, you know, that have impacted on our education. But certainly for me, I suppose my bias would come in as well to say that Mandela or Mbeki were, you know, just wanted to deprive black children of education. It would certainly be the reckless thing to say to me.
You know, I've never studied education, but I know examples in KwaZulu-Natal of, you know, a school that was having a 4% pass rate to get a new headmaster, and 5 years later it's 100%. So we know that leadership in a dysfunctional situation, you know, with the right commitments and so on, can improve things a lot. But there's still a systemic aspect to the problem. And in societies that run good public services for their citizens, you know, I mean, I guess it's possible, you know, in a social democracy in Northern Europe that there's one school that's not working well or something, but systemically they work well. So, I mean, I would really like to know from you and Monica and Ashley and people who've really looked at this, what is actually going on to make it systemically dysfunctional? I mean, we know it can't be reduced to the question of resources if good leadership can transcend that. And one thing I do know about is about housing in Durban. And one thing that's become very clear there, and I don't know if this is relevant to this question, it's become very clear over the last few years, is that the state, in terms of, you know, ministers and in terms of how policies formulated and all of that stuff, is not actually able to govern at all in the way that it wants. What actually happens on the ground is not what the Minister of Housing wants or the MEC or anything like that. And there's two barriers to the ability to govern. I mean, one is people refusing to conform to their rules, you know, occupying land or whatever, doing the kind of things you were talking about, connecting themselves to electricity. But the other is local political elites through the local structures of the party, using government's development programs, which we can critique, but they're there. I mean, using them for patronage. I mean, so the minister can have a big press conference and so on, but he or she's not actually able to do what he or she wants to do, because nothing happens without these local party elites at the local level getting control of it and manipulating it for their own interests. So I'm just wondering if there's a similar thing going on, because if that's the case, then it's not going to be about policy reform. It's not going to be, I mean, we obviously should support the good leaders and try and replicate it, but to systemically change it would require some kind of real systemic political shift in the way that actually existing modes of political power operate. And almost invariably, I mean, there are exceptions, and I'd say Ashley's work is one of them. Academics don't study that. They study the policies and the laws, and which actually have very little to do with what I know about the housing in Durban, and very little to do with what actually goes down.